Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis,
Mhm.
there's this really comforting expectation of precision. Like,
Yeah.
you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it.
Right. It's
Right.
visible. You can categorize it perfectly.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's totally binary. But step into the world of modern business, specifically looking for this concept of the entrepreneur, and that x-ray machine just shatters. It gets incredibly murky.
Oh, yeah. Completely.
Because if I ask you, the listener, to close your eyes right now and picture an entrepreneur, a very specific, honestly aggressive image almost certainly pops into your head.
I mean, I know exactly what you're picturing.
Right. It's a 20-something guy in a gray hoodie operating out of some messy Silicon Valley garage, just, fueled by energy drinks and blind optimism,
Right.
ready to disrupt a legacy industry by next Tuesday.
It's the mythical tech bro archetype. And it dominates our cultural imagination because it's a neat, digestible narrative, right?
Yeah.
It's individual genius triumphing over the old guard.
But the problem is, when you actually pull the data, the historical records, and the behavioral psychology, which is exactly what we are doing today in this deep dive into a massive comprehensive compilation on the mechanics of entrepreneurship, you realize that that hoodie-wearing stereotype is just a statistically insignificant pixel. It's part of a wildly complex, ancient picture.
It really is.
So our mission today is to completely dismantle that modern myth. We're going to look at the genuine DNA of the founder, explore some deeply counterintuitive psychological traits, and examine how this mechanism of business manifests across different cultures.
Yeah, to find that actual DNA, we have to look past the software apps and, the venture capital headlines. The foundational economic definition actually doesn't come from Silicon Valley at all.
Wait, where does it come from?
It comes from an 18th century Irish-French economist named Richard Cantillon.
Irish-French. That's a combo.
Yeah, he was a fascinating guy, and he laid down a surprisingly mechanical framework. He basically said an entrepreneur is someone who buys resources at a certain price and sells them at an uncertain price, deliberately taking on the risk of enterprise.
Okay, let's unpack this. Buys at a certain price, sells at an uncertain price. I mean, that completely strips away the glamour of being a visionary CEO.
It totally does. It isolates the core variable, which is simply navigating risk. Cantillon brilliantly separated the function of the risk-taker from the capitalist.
Meaning the capitalist is just the person who parks their money in the venture.
Exactly, the investor. But isolating the risk-taker inevitably sparked a massive philosophical debate in the 20th century regarding what these people actually do to the macroeconomic landscape.
Right.
So on one side, you have Joseph Schumpeter in the 1930s, who argued that entrepreneurs are agents of and this is a famous phrase, the gale of creative destruction.
A gale of creative destruction implies violence. Like, it implies tearing something down, not just building something new.
Yeah, Schumpeter viewed it as an inherently destructive mechanism. He argued that an entrepreneur combines existing resources in a revolutionary way that actively dismantles old industries.
Okay, give me an example of that.
So his classic example was taking the existing steam engine, combining it with existing wagon-making technology, and creating the automobile.
I think.
By introducing the car, you aren't just creating a better transportation option, you are actively destroying the horse-drawn carriage industry and all the supply chains attached to it.
So Schumpeter's entrepreneur is essentially a forest fire. They violently clear out the old dead brush so a completely new ecosystem of trees can grow in its place.
Right, unnecessary destruction.
But the sources also highlight a competing theory from Israel Kirzner. And Kirzner's model seems a lot less catastrophic.
It is. Kirzner argued that the majority of entrepreneurial innovation is not a destructive gale at all. He viewed the entrepreneur as more of a stabilizing force, someone who recognizes small market inefficiencies and corrects them through incremental improvement.
So no forest fires for him.
No, not at all. Instead of inventing the automobile, Kirzner's entrepreneur notices a flaw in beverage consumption and, replaces a paper-drinking straw with a plastic one.
Or, in today's context, replaces the plastic one back with more durable paper one.
Exactly. It doesn't destroy the beverage industry. It just optimizes a tiny node in the system.
Okay, so if Schumpeter's the forest fire, Kirzner is basically remodeling a kitchen, one cabinet at a time. It's an upgrade, not a structural teardown.
That's a great way to put it.
But this raises a mechanical question about the founder themselves. Like, Does the entrepreneur have to invent the fire, or do they just need to be the one brave enough to strike the match?
Well, Schumpeter was adamant that they just have to strike the match. The innovation does not require the entrepreneur to be the actual inventor of the dramatic new technology.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they simply must be the individual who perceives the potential to combine those existing resources in a novel way and, possesses the sheer will to execute it. And historical evidence actually proves societies have recognized and regulated this specific executor role for centuries.
Yeah, the historical footprints in the sources completely blew up my timeline of when business actually modernized. Like in medieval Germany, you couldn't just hang a shingle and declare yourself an entrepreneur.
No, definitely not.
You had to navigate a strict guild system, prove your competence, and earn a Meister certificate just to be legally allowed to take on that economic risk and train apprentices.
And the Ashanti Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries provides an even more fascinating structural example.
Oh, I love this part.
They developed an entire societal framework to identify and incentivize successful trade entrepreneurs. They called them abarempon, which translates roughly to big men.
Big men, yeah.
Right. And if an individual successfully navigated trade networks in a way that benefited the broader state, they were officially rewarded with an elephant tail as a heraldic badge of honor.
Which is just incredible. It proves that human societies always desperately needed a way to categorize the people willing to sit in that highly uncomfortable space between a certain cost and an uncertain payout.
Absolutely.
Because if a civilization is handing out elephant tails and Meister certificates to these individuals, we have to look at their psychological wiring. It takes a very specific and frankly bizarre kind of brain to voluntarily live in the unknown.
It really does. And understanding that wiring requires looking at the economist Frank Knight, who formalized the taxonomy of the unknown.
Okay, the taxonomy of the unknown.
Yeah, Knight separated uncertainty into 3 distinct tiers. The first tier is risk. Risk is statistically measurable. If you have a jar filled with exactly 5 red balls and 5 white balls, you know the exact mathematical probability of pulling a red one.
All right, it's 50-50. I can build a financial model or an insurance policy around that jar because the parameters are totally fixed.
Exactly. The second tier is ambiguity. This is where you know there are 5 red balls in the jar, but the total number of white balls is hidden from you.
Okay.
So the denominator is missing, making it much harder to measure, though you still grasp the basic mechanics of the game.
I mean, my anxiety spikes just thinking about that missing denominator, but at least I know I'm pulling a ball.
Right, you know the game. But then we reach the third tier, which is the natural habitat of the entrepreneur. This is true uncertainty, often called Nietzschean uncertainty.
Nietzschean uncertainty.
Yes. In this scenario, you reach into a jar and you have absolutely no idea how many objects are inside, what colors they are, or if they are even balls at all. It is entirely unquantifiable.
You are reaching blindly into a literal void.
Exactly.
So the psychological quirk we are looking for isn't just a high tolerance for risk. It's a tolerance for true, unquantifiable uncertainty.
That's the distinction, yeah.
And this is where we have to bust a massive demographic myth. Because the media narrative tells us the person eagerly reaching into that third jar is a 22-year-old college dropout with 0 experience and nothing to lose.
The hoodie guy again?
Exactly. But the data from the MIT and Census Bureau study shatters that. They analyzed 2.7 million company founders who hired at least 1 employee. And the average age of a successful startup founder wasn't 22, it was 45.
Which honestly makes perfect mechanical sense when you understand Nietzschean uncertainty.
How so?
Well, navigating an unquantifiable void requires an immense reservoir of accumulated human capital. You need decades of varied managerial experience, a robust and tested social network, and a deep, granular understanding of where an industry's blind spots actually are.
You just don't have that at 20.
You simply do not possess that operational buffer when you are 19 years old.
And this perfectly explains the millennial paradox mentioned in the text. Like, millennials grew up with social media billionaires as the ultimate cultural icons, yet statistically, they're less likely to engage in entrepreneurship than prior generations.
Right, it's a huge shift.
Because the systemic barriers crushing student debt, an inaccessible housing market, complex regulatory environments, they mean young people lack the financial and social runway to survive reaching into that third jar. They can't absorb the shock of true uncertainty.
The buffer is gone. And without systemic support or accumulated capital, taking on Nietzschean uncertainty is no longer a calculated business decision. It borders on financial suicide.
But I want to push back on this whole psychological profile for a second.
Okay, sure.
We constantly hear about founders being these wildly confident, blindly trusting optimists, the whole move fast and break things
Mm,
mentality. If they're operating in a space of true uncertainty, wouldn't blind optimism just get them killed?
yes. And you've isolated one of the most counterintuitive findings in the entire source text.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to understand founder survival, researchers studied high-stakes, non-routine environments where failure is catastrophic. We're talking nuclear power plants, offshore oil rigs, surgical theaters.
High stakes, definitely.
And they found that the individuals who perform best in those environments are not the optimists. They are the inherently distrusting ones.
Wait, the people running the nuclear plants are the cynics.
They have to be. And when researchers applied this framework to entrepreneurial firms, the data mirrored the oil rigs. Firms led by distrusting entrepreneurs have significantly higher long-term survival rates than those led by optimistic or overconfident founders.
That is wild. Why does a distrusting personality translate to a more resilient business model? Like, if you distrust everyone, how do you even build a team?
It's not about being antisocial. Distrust forces hyper-alertness and the creation of verifiable systems.
Ah,
A
yeah.
distrusting entrepreneur does not discount negative signals or just assume the market will gracefully accept their product. The optimist looks at Knight's third jar and assumes it's full of gold, so they shove their hand in.
Right. Blind faith.
But the distrusting founder assumes the jar is full of scorpions. So they spend weeks engineering a pair of thick Kevlar gloves, implementing rigorous safety protocols, and building a verifiable feedback loop before they ever expose themselves to the void.
So they aren't fearless at all.
Mm,
They're just highly operationalizing their fear. I love that distinction.
exactly. It's managed fear.
But if the optimal founder is a 45-year-old distrusting cynic wearing Kevlar gloves, you would assume the businesses they build are all incredibly defensive and uniform. Yet the sources show the exact opposite.
They do, yeah.
Because the psychological profile is so complex, the structures they build to solve problems are wildly diverse.
Mhm.
We aren't just talking about venture-backed software platforms here.
No, the mechanisms of combining resources change drastically depending on the cultural and economic context. Ethnic entrepreneurship is a prime example of this.
Definitely.
Historically, immigrant populations have profoundly reshaped mainstream markets, and not out of opportunistic luxury, but out of absolute necessity.
Yeah, the examples in the text are iconic. The traditional UK fish and chips industry was pioneered in the 1860s by a Jewish immigrant named Joseph Mallon.
Right.
And the Slazenger sports brand, which has supplied tennis balls to Wimbledon since 1902, was founded by Jewish brothers Ralph and Albert Slazenger.
The mechanical innovation here is the utilization of alternative, intangible networks. When an immigrant group arrives in a new context, they are frequently locked out of traditional commercial banking and established supply chains.
They just don't have access.
So to survive, they leverage deep, high-trust community networks to secure capital, often through rotating credit associations, and mobilize labor. The business structure is built on social bonds and localized reputation rather than institutional contracts.
And the fundamental metrics for success change depending on the model, too. Look at social and feminist entrepreneurship.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
A social entrepreneur might run a high-end, highly profitable restaurant, but the math on their P&L serves a different master. They aren't maximizing profit to distribute dividends to shareholders. They are optimizing profit specifically to funnel it into housing and employment for the homeless.
The profit is a tool, not the terminal goal.
Right.
Feminist entrepreneurship operates on a similar dual-layered mandate. These founders build enterprises focused on wealth creation, but they inextricably link it to systemic social change, cooperation, equality, and mutual respect.
So the culture reflects the mission.
Exactly. The internal corporate governance often reflects those values, prioritizing flat cooperative hierarchies over traditional top-down extraction models.
So what does this all mean for how an entrepreneur structurally manages their career over a lifetime? The text categorizes founders behaviorally: novice, serial, portfolio, and project-based.
Right, the career structures.
Instead of relying on that old cliche of spinning plates, let's look at this through the lens of real estate development. A portfolio entrepreneur is like a developer managing a massive master-planned community.
That's a good analogy.
They own and operate multiple distinct businesses concurrently, and their primary skill is managing the interconnected grid of resources and capital between all those separate properties.
It requires immense delegation and systems-level thinking.
Yeah.
By contrast, a serial entrepreneur operates more like a high-end house flipper. They acquire a property, pour all their operational focus into renovating it, sell it or exit the business, and only then move entirely to the next property. They operate sequentially, not concurrently.
And the data shows that serial entrepreneurs actually have a measurably lower failure rate on their subsequent ventures. Because they are carrying the human capital, the lessons learned from the previous flip into the new project.
They are actively iterating on their own learned skills. But then you have the third structure, the project-based entrepreneur, which requires an entirely different kind of agility. Think of complex software architecture or Hollywood film production.
How does the real estate analogy apply to a film producer?
Well, a project-based entrepreneur is essentially building a fully functioning, massive city for a weekend festival and then tearing the entire thing down on Monday morning.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They assemble a highly specialized temporary organization, achieve a singular, massive, objective-like shooting a blockbuster movie, rapidly disband the team, and then start from absolute zero, finding a new script and a new crew for the next project.
That sounds exhausting.
The network agility and reputation management required to continuously rebuild that city is just staggering.
But regardless of whether you are managing a master-planned community, flipping a house, or throwing a weekend festival, you hit the same undeniable wall. You need resources. You need capital, machinery, and distribution. And the sources point to a massive strategic friction here. How you acquire those resources permanently alters the trajectory of the business.
Right. Resources broadly split into two categories, tangible and intangible. Tangible resources are easily quantified on a balance sheet. Physical machinery, land, cash reserves, inventory.
The stuff you can touch.
Exactly. But the truly defensible moats of a business are often the intangible resources: brand reputation, institutional know-how, proprietary intellectual property, and those entrepreneurial networks we just discussed. And acquiring either requires capital.
Which forces founders into the great standoff. Venture capital versus bootstrapping. If a VC firm offers a founder $10 million to scale their startup, the mainstream narrative assumes the founder pops champagne and takes the check.
Of course, that's the dream, right?
Right. So why on earth would a rational person reject millions of dollars, max out their own personal credit cards, delay payments to vendors, and subject themselves to the agonizing grind of bootstrapping?
It comes down to a brutal, fundamental conflict of incentive models. An external investor, particularly a venture capital fund, operates on a very rigid mathematical timeline.
Because they have bosses too.
Exactly. They have their own limited partners to pay back. They require a massive return on their investment, typically within a 5 to 10-year window. Their entire operational mandate is to push the founder for rapid scaling and a high valuation exit, usually either an acquisition by a larger corporation or going public via an IPO.
They need the money multiplier to execute, regardless of whether that hypergrowth actually serves the core product.
Right. So if you are the social entrepreneur we discussed, or if your goal is to build a sustainable generational family business, taking VC money introduces a fatal systemic flaw.
You lose your mission.
You trade equity for capital, and equity is control. Once external investors hold board seats, their fiduciary duty is to maximize short-term shareholder returns.
So they can force your hand.
They can legally force you to abandon your philanthropic mission, compromise your product quality to hit quarterly targets, or simply fire you from your own company if you refuse to scale at their mandated pace.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a literal battle for the soul of the enterprise. It's the ultimate speed versus control trade-off.
It is.
For many founders, retaining absolute governance over the vision and the underlying why of the company is worth enduring the financial suffocation of bootstrapping. You aren't just selling shares. You are potentially selling the very reason the company exists.
The control struggle is the invisible weight behind every entrepreneurial decision. It really is.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. What I want you, the listener, to take away from this exploration is that entrepreneurship is not a genetic trait reserved for a chosen few living in a specific tech hub.
Not at all.
Whether you are an entrepreneur fighting to optimize supply chains from inside a massive corporation, a project-based gig worker hustling in film production, or someone simply shifting your mindset to solve a logistical problem in your local community, it is fundamentally about how you choose to navigate true nation uncertainty. It's about recombining the resources around you under pressure to create value.
And the skill lies entirely in that recombination,
Right.
which actually leads to one final, wildly unexpected application from the research.
Oh, lay it on me.
In 2014, scholars published a study directly linking the mechanics of modern entrepreneurship to the history of sea piracy.
Wait, actual Golden Age pirates?
Actual pirates.
Okay.
The researchers suggested taking a strictly non-moral approach to historical piracy, using it as a literal blueprint for business model generation and entrepreneurship education today.
That is amazing.
Think about the mechanical parallels. Pirates operated in extreme nation uncertainty. They were highly project-based, rapidly recombining resources, often repurposing captured ships in completely novel ways.
And they had to manage incredibly complex, high-stakes teams in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly that. They engineered highly sophisticated equity and risk-sharing structures among their crews. To align incentives and prevent mutiny, they developed articles of agreement that dictated exactly how the spoils would be divided based on roles.
Wow.
And they even utilized the quartermaster as a democratic check against the captain's executive power.
So they were operating early, decentralized, autonomous organizations.
Basically, yeah.
So the ultimate archetype of the entrepreneur isn't the guy in the hoodie in the garage. The real archetype is Blackbeard engineering a complex equity split on a stolen galleon.
It certainly reframes the modern concept of a hostile takeover, doesn't it? I would invite you to mull over what today's agile startups and decentralized businesses might actually learn from the equity structures and risk mitigation of 18th century pirates navigating the high seas.
That is a phenomenal image to leave on. Next time you picture an entrepreneur, look past the Silicon Valley garage. Look for the forest fire making way for new growth. Look for the 45-year-old cynic carefully building systems to survive failure. Look for the person reaching into a dark jar of true uncertainty when everyone else runs away. And maybe, just maybe, look for a pirate ship on the horizon. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Imagine you are an ancient person walking through the desert and you just stumble upon a crashed alien spaceship.
Oh, wow.
Right. And you manage to pry a piece of the metallic hull off, you hammer it down, and you fashion it into a ceremonial dagger for your king.
Which sounds completely like a sci-fi movie.
It really does. But the crazy thing is, thousands of years before the Iron Age officially began, humanity was doing exactly that.
Yes, they absolutely were.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are exploring a massive, expansive Wikipedia repository on the Iron Age today. And our mission is to explore how human civilization leveled up from bronze to iron.
A massive leap for humanity.
It really was. Okay, let's unpack this, because the transition wasn't just some obvious technological stepping stone that everyone was thrilled to take.
No, not at all.
It was a monumental hurdle of physics, of chemistry, and sheer willpower, and it was sparked by a global supply chain crisis that fundamentally redefined the world.
Yeah, and the scale of that innovation is staggering when you consider where it actually started.
Right.
To really understand the Iron Age, we have to strip away the misconception that it began the first time a human being held an iron object.
Because they had it way earlier.
Exactly. As you pointed out with that spaceship analogy, early humans possessed iron artifacts millennia before they could actually extract iron from the earth.
Right, because that early material was meteoric iron, right? Like a natural alloy of iron and nickel that literally fell from outer space.
Yeah, literally from the sky.
The sources highlight 9 small iron beads found in burials at Gertza in Lower Egypt. And those date all the way back to 3200 BC.
Which is incredibly early.
Right. Then you have King Tutankhamun's famous dagger from the 13th century BC. Modern X-ray fluorescence analysis actually proved the blade was forged from a meteorite that landed in northern Egypt.
It's amazing that we can trace it back to that specific impact.
It really is. But, I mean, scavenging fragments of a meteorite is incredible, sure, but it doesn't spark an industrial revolution.
No, it doesn't.
It's rare, it's highly prized, and it is completely unscalable.
What's fascinating here is the massive gulf between scavenging a raw extraterrestrial material and industrializing a terrestrial one.
Right, finding it versus making it.
Exactly. True Iron Age culture isn't defined by a pharaoh owning a magical space dagger. It's defined by the mass production of smelted iron, and specifically, the intentional creation of carbon steel alloys.
Okay, wait, I'm stuck on the physics here. Because if I'm an ancient blacksmith, my standard Neolithic kiln, which, I mean, they were using those as far back as 6000 BC, hits maybe 900 degrees Celsius?
Yeah, right around there.
And that is plenty hot to melt copper, which liquefies around 1085 degrees.
Right.
And it's way more than enough for tin, which melts at an incredibly low 232 degrees.
Right, it melts super easily.
So you mix those together, you get bronze. It's essentially just advanced pottery technology applied to rocks. But if I throw terrestrial iron ore into that same 900-degree kiln, absolutely nothing happens, right?
Nothing but warm rocks.
Wow.
Yeah, to even begin smelting iron, you have to hit temperatures above 12,250 degrees Celsius.
That is a huge jump.
It is. And this is the thermodynamic hurdle that kept the Bronze Age going for thousands of years, even though literal mountains of iron ore were sitting right under their feet the whole time.
Just waiting there.
Yeah, hitting 1,250 degrees requires building entirely new, highly complex furnaces with forced air bellows.
And even if I manage to build that furnace, the iron doesn't melt into a nice, easy-to-pour liquid like bronze does it?
Not at all. Because ancient furnaces still couldn't reach the true melting point of pure iron, which is over 1,500 degrees Celsius. The iron ore doesn't liquefy.
So what does it do?
Well, the carbon monoxide in the furnace basically strips the oxygen away from the iron oxide.
Yeah.
And what it leaves behind is this glowing, spongy mass of solid iron mixed with liquid rock and impurities.
Oh, gross.
Yeah, it's called a bloom.
So you have this searing, hot, I don't know, metallic sponge dripping with liquid glass and slag.
Exactly. And the only way to make it usable is to drag that 1,250-degree bloom out of the furnace with tongs and immediately start beating it with a hammer.
Oh, my God.
You are literally squeezing the liquid slag out of the solid iron sponge through sheer physical force.
Which sounds exhausting.
It was brutal work, and this is actually where we get the term wrought iron. It is iron that has been worked or wrought by hand.
But pure wrought iron is relatively soft, isn't it? I mean, you might think of iron today as this incredibly sturdy, modern building block. But put yourself in the shoes of a 12th century BC farmer for a second.
Right.
A pure iron sword will bend if you hit a shield too hard.
It absolutely will.
But a good bronze sword will hold its edge beautifully. So to them, iron wasn't an upgrade. It was a cheap, frustrating downgrade.
Yeah, it really was.
Why would I spend decades trying to invent a 12,250-degree forced air furnace and break my back hammering a glowing sponge just to get a metal that is worse than the bronze I already have? It makes absolutely no economic sense.
Well, they didn't want to. They were forced to.
Really?
Yeah. Ancient peoples did not wake up one day and decide to invent the Iron Age. They were pushed into it by a systemic collapse.
Oh, wow.
See, to make iron harder than bronze, you have to turn it into steel.
Right, by introducing carbon.
Exactly. Think of pure iron at a molecular level, like a ball pit filled with large, identical plastic balls.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If you step into that pit, the balls shift and slide past one another really easily.
Yeah.
That is why pure iron is soft and bends.
Got it.
Now imagine pouring thousands of tiny marbles into that same ball pit.
Oh, they'd fall right into all the little gaps.
Right. They fall into all the empty gaps between the large balls, jamming the entire structure so the large balls can no longer slide.
That makes perfect sense.
Those tiny marbles are the carbon atoms from the charcoal fire diffusing into the iron's crystalline lattice.
Wow.
That is how you create carbon steel, which is infinitely harder, lighter, and more durable than bronze. But figuring out how to regulate that carbon admixture was a desperate trial and error process born out of the Bronze Age collapse.
So around 1200 BC, the highly interconnected, globalized world of the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean simply fractured. Palaces burned, empires fell, and international trade routes were completely severed.
Yeah, it was chaotic. We have to look at a scholar named Anthony Snodgrass here. His theory, detailed in the sources, points to a catastrophic disruption in the supply of tin.
Right, because you need tin for bronze.
Exactly. Copper is relatively common in the Mediterranean, but tin is incredibly rare. During the Bronze Age, tin had to be shipped over massive distances, sometimes overland, all the way from ancient Afghanistan.
So it was the ancient world's equivalent of crude oil, or, I don't know, semiconductor chips today.
That is a perfect analogy. The trade routes freeze. Suddenly you have zero tin.
And if you have no tin, you cannot make bronze.
Exactly. You can't forge new plows for your agriculture. You can't equip your soldiers to defend the city walls. It is a true existential crisis.
And at first they panicked, right? The archaeological record shows them frantically recycling old bronze implements, like melting down statues and heirloom weapons.
Anything they could find.
But eventually, the scrap runs out. You are surrounded by hostile forces, you are trying to survive, and you are staring at these terrestrial iron ores that you previously ignored. So, what does this all mean? We are looking at a prehistoric supply chain crisis forcing a technological leap.
It is a profound testament to human resilience, really. When the global network collapsed, local innovation took over.
They had no choice.
Right. Metal workers desperately experimented until they mastered the forced air furnace, the brutal physical labor of hot working the bloom, and eventually the precise chemistry of carbon steel.
What strikes me is that once the trade routes eventually recovered and tin became available again, nobody went back to bronze for their tools.
No, the genie was out of the bottle.
Right, iron was ubiquitous, it was in the ground everywhere, and forged steel was vastly superior to cast bronze. The crisis had permanently forced humanity to level up.
And, the sources also debunk a very stubborn old myth regarding this transition.
How about the Hittites?
Yes. For a long time, historians claimed that the Hittite Empire in Anatolia had a strict monopoly on iron smelting, and they used this closely guarded secret weapon to conquer their neighbors.
That's what I was taught in school, honestly.
A lot of people were. But modern archaeological consensus shows that simply isn't true. Iron objects from that era are found equally distributed in Egypt, the Levant, and other regions.
So it wasn't a state secret?
No. The knowledge was spreading organically as a widespread reaction to the tin shortage, not as some state-kept military secret.
So if a supply chain crisis forced the Mediterranean into the Iron Age out of desperation, what happens to an isolated superpower that actually has the luxury of choosing? Do they embrace it?
Well,
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the Egyptian relationship with iron is deeply tied to their theology. You would think a massive superpower would jump all over this military advancement, but they resisted it for centuries.
yeah, iron is exceptionally scarce in ancient Egyptian antiquities.
Which is wild.
It is, because meteorites fall from the sky, and terrestrial iron is found in the harsh, unlivable deserts surrounding the Nile Valley. The Egyptians viewed iron as an impure metal.
Right, they associate it specifically with Seth.
Exactly, Seth, the god of chaos, storms, and the desert.
They literally called it the bone of Seth.
And because of that deeply ingrained cultural and religious baggage, they refused to use it for anything ceremonial or significant. They possessed the metallurgical knowledge, but they stubbornly stuck with bronze as their primary metal.
It's like a modern society flat out refusing to adopt the internet because they decide it's inherently evil.
That's a great way to put it.
You might feel morally superior, but eventually you are going to get outpaced by your tech-savvy neighbors. Egypt held onto bronze right up until the Neo-Assyrian Empire, wielding hardened iron weapons, came knocking and conquered them in 671 BC.
It is a stark reminder that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to navigate the cultural framework of the people adopting it. Contrast Egypt's resistance with Europe's elaboration.
Europe went all in. Ironworking slowly spreads across Europe between the 11th century BC and 500 BC. And the cultures there, specifically the Hostet and Latin cultures, don't just use iron for utilitarian swords. They turn the metallurgy into a high art form.
They really did.
The sources describe how European metalwork shifted from casting molten metal in molds to hammering raw iron into these elaborate, curvilinear, flowing shapes.
They completely mastered the malleability of the metal. But beyond art, iron completely revolutionized their community structures and their relationship with the environment.
How so?
Well, with tougher iron axes and plows, they could clear dense European forests much faster. They could farm heavier clay-rich soils and construct massive earthworks.
The hill forts. The sources mention Maiden Castle in Dorset, England. This thing is a massive, sprawling fortification with complex, labyrinthine earthwork defenses.
It's a marvel of ancient engineering.
And it's just one of over 2,000 Iron Age hill forts built in Britain alone. While Egypt is shunning iron because of desert gods, Europe is using it to completely terraform their landscape and build heavily fortified, localized societies.
It shows how a single technological breakthrough fractures into wildly different cultural expressions depending on who is wielding the hammer.
Absolutely.
But if we want to talk about shattering expectations of how history works, we really have to look entirely outside the Mediterranean and European spheres.
We need to talk about Asia, and specifically India, because they didn't just learn to smelt iron, they became absolute masters of its chemistry.
Oh, for sure.
The sources detail how, as early as 300 BC, Indian metallurgists were producing incredibly high-quality steel using the crucible technique.
This was a massive leap in applied chemistry.
Yeah.
Instead of just hammering carbon into a bloom, Indian metalworkers would take high-purity wrought iron, mix it with specific carbon-rich organic materials like wood and leaves, and then add glass.
Glass.
Yeah. They would place all of this inside a clay crucible, seal it completely shut, and bake it in a furnace.
They essentially created a pressurized chemical vacuum chamber out of clay. That blows my mind.
It's incredible. The glass acts as a flux, melting down and pulling any remaining impurities out of the iron. Inside that sealed, oxygen-deprived environment, the iron absorbs the carbon from the organic matter perfectly and uniformly.
Wow.
The result was a premium, high-carbon steel, often referred to later as Wootz steel, that was highly sought after across the ancient world.
Then you have China, which flips the script in a completely different way.
Right.
The sources note that China developed a fully functioning written language before they ever started smelting iron.
Right.
And because their bronze casting technology and furnace designs were already so phenomenally capable of reaching incredibly high temperatures, they bypassed the primitive bloomery stage entirely.
They went straight to the next level.
Exactly. They transitioned almost directly into producing cast iron during the Qin dynasty.
The traditional markers we use to define the Iron Age just don't map neatly onto the Chinese historical record. But the most staggering departure from the standard historical narrative actually happens in sub-Saharan Africa.
When I was reading this part of the source material, I actually had to stop and reread it.
The timeline is crazy, right?
Sub-Saharan Africa had no universal Bronze Age. Across vast swaths of the continent, they transitioned directly from using stone tools to smelting iron. They bypassed the copper and bronze eras entirely.
Entirely.
Archaeologists have found evidence of independent iron smelting inventions at a site called Leja in Nigeria and in the Central African Republic, dating as far back as 2000 BC.
2000 BC. That is 8 centuries before the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean forced the issue there.
But wait, how does a civilization hit 1250 degrees Celsius without the stepping stone of bronze kilns?
Through brilliant indigenous pyrotechnology.
Okay.
Rather than relying on the forced air bellows used in the Mediterranean, many African metalworkers constructed tall, natural draft furnaces out of clay.
Like chimneys.
Exactly like massive chimneys.
Man.
As the fire burned inside, the shape of the furnace naturally drew oxygen in through tubes at the bottom called tuyers at incredibly high speeds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the physics of the chimney effect created the intense heat required to smelt iron ore without needing centuries of bronze working as a precursor.
This technology then spread south and east across the continent with the Great Bantu expansion. But, this completely breaks the neat little timeline we're taught in school.
It does.
How can historians even continue to use the three-age systems, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, if a massive continent like Africa just bypassed bronze entirely and figured out advanced natural draft iron smelting on their own? Doesn't that make the terminology obsolete?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are hitting on a major debate in modern archaeology.
Yeah.
The three-age system was literally invented in the 1830s by a Danish museum curator named Christian Jørgensen Thomsen. He was just trying to organize a disorganized pile of artifacts in a display case in Copenhagen.
That's hilarious.
Right. It is a 19th century European construct designed to explain European history.
Yet it gets applied to the whole world as if it's a universal law of human development.
That is the fundamental flaw. History is not a neat, linear staircase where every civilization takes the exact same steps at the exact same time. It is a messy, localized web of adaptation.
So Africa didn't skip a step?
Africa didn't skip a step because there were no required steps. They had abundant iron ore, they developed brilliant furnace engineering, and they solved the problem in front of them without needing to wait for a tin supply chain that didn't exist in their region. It highlights how human ingenuity is parallel, not just sequential.
It radically reframes the whole narrative. So let's recap this incredible journey for you listening right now. We started with ancient elites scavenging alien meteorites just to make jewelry. We move into the intense thermodynamic chemistry of carbon steel, jamming tiny carbon marbles into an iron ball pit, which was only discovered because a catastrophic global supply chain crisis severed the tin routes.
An incredible chain of events.
Right. And then we saw Egypt religiously boycott the new metal out of fear of desert gods, while Europe used it to terraform their landscape into thousands of massive hill forts. And finally, we saw how innovators in India engineered pressurized clay crucibles and how metal workers across sub-Saharan Africa completely shattered the European timeline by building towering draft furnaces to invent iron smelting independently.
It is a remarkable testament to adaptability under pressure. And, it brings up a fascinating point about how this era officially concludes.
Oh, how does it end?
In the archaeological record, the Iron Age technically ends not because we stopped using iron. I mean, obviously, our modern world is built on steel.
Yeah, we use it every day.
Right. It ends because a region enters the historical record.
Oh, I see. The era is defined by the dirt and the metal until the ink takes over.
Exactly. The transition from prehistory to history. So the Iron Age ends in the ancient Near East around 550 BC with the written histories of Herodotus. In Central and Western Europe, it ends with the Roman conquests in the 1st century BC because the Romans brought meticulous written administration with them.
They love their paperwork.
They really did. And in Scandinavia, the Germanic Iron Age doesn't end until around 800 AD, right at the dawn of the Viking Age. The metal remains, but the way humanity documents its memory permanently changes.
Which is wild to think about.
This raises an important question for you to consider as we wrap up.
Okay.
If the ancient Iron Age officially ended because humanity began leaving behind written records instead of just metal artifacts in the soil, how will future archaeologists define our current age?
Oh, that's a good question.
We live in an incredibly digitized world, but digital data is staggeringly fragile. If our servers degrade, our hard drives fail, and our cloud records are wiped out by the immense span of time, what will be left for the archaeologists of the year 10,000 to find?
Not much data, probably.
Right. Will they look back at the rusted skeletons of our steel skyscrapers, the metal chassis of our electric cars, and simply call us a second, much taller Iron Age?
Second Iron Age.
Wow. We think we are at the top of the escalator, but we might just be leaving behind a slightly more complicated layer of rust for the next civilization to dig up.
Exactly.
That is a thought that is going to stay with me for a long time. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
I want you to take a second and just think about where your actual self lives. Like every memory you hold on to, every complex skill you've ever learned, your entire perception of the room you're sitting in right now.
Yeah.
All of that is currently happening within this sheet of tissue just behind your forehead that is roughly, what, 2 to 4 millimeters thick?
Yeah, it's staggering when you actually stop and visualize it.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 to 4 millimeters.
Right.
That is basically the thickness of a standard wedding band.
A piece of jewelry.
Mm-hmm.
Your entire reality is contained in a sliver of tissue the size of a piece of jewelry.
It's wild.
It really is. So we've got this massive stack of anatomical and biological research for today's deep dive.
We do, yeah. Lots of ground to cover.
And our mission here is to unpack how, 14 to 16 billion neurons fit into that tiny space.
Mm-hmm.
And also how they actively build themselves from the inside out, which is crazy. We're going to go from the macro level folds down to the microscopic wiring.
And we're also going to look at its surprisingly ancient evolutionary origins, right?
Exactly. I promise that by the time we finish this deep dive, you will never look at your own brain or, the brains of elephants, birds, or even sea worms in the exact same way again.
You really won't. I mean, it fundamentally shifts your perspective on what intelligence actually even is.
Right. So before we get into the microscopic wiring, we kind of need to address the bizarre physical packaging.
A walnut shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why does the human brain look like a wrinkled walnut?
Well, in anatomical terms, those outer folds and ridges, they're called gyri, and the deep grooves between them are sulci.
Okay.
But, the vocabulary is nearly as important as the actual mechanism of gyrification itself, which is essentially, it's an extreme evolutionary solution to latency.
Latency. See, my first thought was always that it's just a space issue.
Oh, like just fitting it in the skull.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're trying to cram this massive sheet. I think our sources say if you unfolded the cortex, it'd be about 1/4 of a square meter total into this tiny little glove box of a skull.
Right, right.
But a much better way to look at it, especially for anyone who has ever built a computer or worked in IT, is cable management in a massive server farm.
Oh, that is a much more accurate framework.
Absolutely. It's about speed, right?
Right, exactly. When you have billions of neurons that need to talk to each other in like fractions of a second, physical distance is your absolute worst enemy.
Wow. Okay.
So by folding the cortex, regions of the brain that need to communicate constantly are physically brought closer together. The biological wiring is literally shorter.
This is a shortcut.
Exactly. And that minimizes lag, speeds up processing, and it actually saves an enormous amount of metabolic energy.
So if latency is the main issue, I mean, that perfectly explains why smaller mammals like mice or shrews have completely smooth brains.
Yeah, they do.
They just don't have enough neurons to generate that kind of communication lag, right?
Yeah.
The distances inside their skulls are already microscopic.
Right. They just don't need the extreme folds to optimize their circuitry.
Right.
But, as brains scale up in size across different species, those major deep folds become a physical necessity.
Right.
And they actually begin to act as borders, dividing the cerebrum into distinct functional territories.
Now the lobes.
Yes, exactly. They map out the 4 main lobes we always hear about in basic biology class, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the limbic lobe on the medial side, and the insular cortex, which is actually completely hidden. It's buried deep within those folds.
Wow. You know what really stands out in the research stack is the actual thickness of this tissue.
Oh, the scaling.
Yeah. We said 2 to 4 millimeters for humans, but that thickness scales logarithmically with overall brain weight across species.
It's fascinating.
Right. Like a tiny shrew has a cortex about 0.5 millimeter thick, but then you look at a fin whale, one of the largest animals on Earth with this massive heavy brain.
Right.
And their cortex is essentially the exact same thickness as ours, like right in that 2 to 4 millimeter range.
It's so consistent. And even within your own head right now, that thickness actually fluctuates depending on the job of that specific area.
Oh, really?
Yeah, generally speaking, your sensory cortex, so the areas processing touch, sight, and sound, that's visibly thinner than your motor cortex, which is responsible for executing voluntary movements.
Which ties into a really interesting clinical curiosity mentioned in the research.
Oh, the migraine studies.
Yes. If you're someone listening who suffers from chronic migraines, early MRI studies suggested you might actually have a thicker somatosensory cortex.
Right, which is the specific part of the brain that processes pain and touch.
Exactly. So the medical community was stuck in this chicken and egg scenario. Does the repeated trauma of pain attacks physically thicken the tissue over time? Or does a naturally thicker cortex make someone prone to migraines?
And that whole debate perfectly demonstrates why we can't just stop at early observational studies.
Right, because the later stuff showed something different.
Yeah, later, much more robust studies with massive patient populations found no significant change in cortical thickness for migraine patients at all.
Wow. So it was just a false positive.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It turns out trying to map a highly subjective, complex experience like chronic pain directly to a physical, structural change in the brain tissue is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've established that the brain folds itself to minimize latency and speed up communication.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually slice into that 2 millimeter fold to see the physical wiring that requires such a tight layout, what are you actually looking at?
Well, you're looking at the neocortex, which makes up about 90% of your cerebral cortex. And when early neuroanatomists first stained cross-sections of this tissue back in the early 20th century, they didn't just find a random, messy jumble of cells.
Right. It's not just a soup.
Far from it. They found this incredibly structured, highly organized architecture divided into 6 distinct horizontal layers.
6 layers. I keep visualizing this as like a highly efficient 6-story factory building.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right, where every single floor handles a specific part of the cognitive supply chain. But before we break down what each floor does, let me see if I can synthesize a rule here based on evolution.
Okay, let's hear it.
If layers equal intelligence, does that mean like humans have 6, a cat has maybe 4, and a frog has 2, like a ladder?
You would think it works like that, right?
Yeah.
Like a clean ladder of progress, building up layer by layer as animals get smarter.
Yeah, that seems logical.
But nature absolutely hates ladders. African elephants are some of the most socially complex, highly intelligent mammals alive,
Yeah.
and their cortex is entirely missing layer 4.
Wait, what? They just skipped a floor of the factory.
Completely missing.
How does their brain even process information without a whole floor?
So to understand how wild that evolutionary deviation is, we really need to look at what layer 40 normally does in us.
Okay.
In a human brain, layer 4 is the internal granular layer. It basically functions as the factory's receiving dock.
The receiving dock, got it.
It's the primary target for incoming sensory information from the thalamus, which is this structure deeper in the brain acting as a central relay station.
Mm-hmm.
But in elephants, as well as whales and hippos, those sensory inputs bypass the traditional receiving dock entirely and wire straight into layer 3.
That completely breaks the mold. I mean, it proves there isn't just one single rigid blueprint for building a highly intelligent mammalian brain.
It absolutely shatters the blueprint. But, going back to the standard human factory design, once layer 4 receives that raw sensory data, it needs to be processed and contextualized.
Right, you can't just leave it on the dock.
Exactly. And that's where layers 2 and 3 come into play. We call them the external granular and external pyramidal layers.
I notice those two layers get glossed over a lot in basic biology summaries. What are they actually doing with all that data?
Well, they serve as the internal communication network.
Okay.
So while other layers are busy talking to the outside world or the spinal cord, layers 2 and 3 are entirely focused on talking to other parts of the cortex.
Oh, I see.
They send signals across the hemispheres via the corpus callosum, basically bridging the gap so your left brain knows exactly what your right brain is doing.
Like an internal intercom system.
Yeah. They are making the vast web of connections that allow for complex associations and higher-level thinking.
Okay, so layer 4 gets the raw data. Layers 2 and the 3 share it across the brain to figure out what it means.
Right.
But what happens when I finally need to act on it? Like deciding to reach out and grab my glass of water right here.
So that physical command gets shipped down to layer V, the internal pyramidal layer.
The shipping department.
Exactly. This floor contains these massive structures called giant pyramidal Betz cells.
Betz cells, okay.
And their axons, which you can basically picture as long biological transmission cables, they leave the cortex, travel all the way through the brainstem, and go straight down your spinal cord to directly control your muscles.
That's incredible. And sitting right beneath that is layer 6, right? The bottom floor right above the white matter.
Yeah.
And for anyone unfamiliar, white matter is essentially the brain's dense underlying network of biological fiber optic cables connecting different brain regions.
Perfect analogy. So layer 6X sits right on top of that network, acting as the quality control department.
Quality control, how so?
Well, it sends feedback fibers back down to the thalamus, and the precision here is just breathtaking.
Really?
Yeah, neurons from one specific column of the cortex connect back to the exact thalamic neurons that feed them.
Yeah.
It operates as an adjustable gain control.
Oh, like a volume dial.
Exactly. Layer 6 can send an excitatory signal to turn the volume up on a specific sensory input, or an inhibitory signal to filter it out as just background noise.
Wow, which brings us all the way up to the roof, layer 1.
The molecular layer.
Or what I like to think of as the CEO suite.
It's a very sparse, strange layer, honestly. It doesn't have many neuron cell bodies of its own.
Then what's in there?
Instead, it's mostly made up of apical tufts. These are the extending tree-like branches from neurons down to the deeper layers.
Oh, reaching all the way up.
Yeah, they reach all the way up to the surface, mingling with a massive web of connections coming from other parts of the brain.
So the research describes layer I as integrating ascending sensory inputs with top-down expectations. Let's try to ground that in reality. Think about the room you, the listener, are sitting in right now. Your brain's top-down expectation already knows the layout of your furniture, the color of the walls, where the door is.
Right, you have a mental model. But your bottom-up sensory input is just raw incoming data.
Okay.
So if the lights are off, your eyes only see vague, dark shapes. Layer I is where the brain combines what you expect to see with the raw data of what you're actually seeing.
It's comparing notes.
Exactly. It dynamically gates and sorts these signals, essentially shaping your real-time perception of reality.
So if I jump because I think a shadow in the corner is an intruder, but it turns out to be a coat rack.
That is layer I misinterpreting the data and allowing your expectations to override reality.
That is wild. Knowing how this incredibly complex, 6-layered factory operates forces a massive logistical question, though.
How it's built.
Yeah. How does a developing fetus actually build this structure from scratch? My assumption, and I think most people's natural assumption, is that building a brain must be exactly like building a house.
Foundation first.
Right. You pour the foundation, build the first floor, then the second floor, and eventually cap it with the roof.
It's a perfectly logical assumption that happens to be completely backward.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the cerebral cortex is actually built inside out.
Walk us through that mechanism, because how do you physically build a biological structure inside out?
So during embryonic development, the cortex starts near the ventricles, which are these fluid-filled cavities deep inside the neural tube.
And the neural tube becomes the nervous system.
Exactly. Down in this deep zone, you have these incredible structures called radial glia.
Okay.
You could think of radial glia as serving two distinct purposes. They are the stem cell factory workers, producing the new neurons, but they also form the physical scaffolding the neurons use to move.
Wait, so they create a brand new neuron and then basically hand it a pole to climb?
Literally. They provide these long physical fibers that stretch all the way from the deep ventricular zone up to the outer surface of the developing brain.
That is bizarre.
It gets crazier. When a new neuron is born, it physically crawls up this radial glial scaffolding. The very first neurons generated migrate out and form the deepest layers of the mature cortex layers 6 and 5.
Okay, so the foundation is laid first. That part makes sense.
But when the next batch of neurons is born, they migrate up the scaffolding and travel past the older neurons.
Wait, they climb through them?
Yes, they climb right through layer 6 and 5 to form layer 4. And then the next batch climbs past 6, 5, and 4 to form layer 3. So the youngest, newest neurons are always navigating through densely packed older cells to reach the superficial upper layers.
That sounds exhausting for the cells. Are there any exceptions to that inside-out rule?
There is one notable exception, and it actually happens in primates.
Oh, us.
Yeah. In rodents, the creation of neurons eventually just stops. But in us, neurogenesis for layer I, that CEO suite we talked about, actually continues throughout the entire period of cortical development.
It was still building the roof.
Right. It continuously adds new cells to the top layer while the rest of the cortex is being built inside out beneath it.
This brings up a massive coordination problem, though. If a radial glial cell is just pumping out blank slate stem cells, how does a given neuron know what its permanent job is?
That is the big question.
Like, how does it know, oh, I need to process vision at the back of the head versus I need to control arm movement at the front?
This brings us to cortical patterning, which is essentially a molecular tug of war.
A tug of war.
Yeah. Early in embryonic development, there's a primordial blueprint called the protomap. The functional landscape of this map is determined by opposing gradients of chemicals, specifically transcription factors like MX2 and PAX6.
Okay, MX2 and PAX6, but how does a chemical gradient actually tell a cell what to become?
Think of these chemicals not as static paint on a canvas, but as fading gradients of sound.
Like a speaker.
Exactly, like the volume of music fading as you walk away from a concert speaker. A blank stem cell basically listens to how loud the MX2 signal is versus the PAX6 signal.
No, I see.
That precise ratio of chemical volume flips specific genetic switches inside the cell to turn it into a visual neuron versus a motor neuron.
Our sources note that MX2 is highly concentrated at the back of the brain where the visual cortex lives, right?
Yes.
And PAX6 is highly concentrated at the front in the motor regions, so they naturally push against each other. What happens if one of those signals gets weak, say, through a genetic mutation?
Well, if a mutation weakens PAX6, its chemical volume drops. And without PAX6 pushing back, MX2 physically expands its territory outward.
Wait, it just takes over?
Yes. The area of the brain normally dedicated to visual processing actually gets larger, physically taking over space that should have been dedicated to motor control.
That's incredible.
It is a literal microscopic turf war, determining the physical layout of your cognitive functions.
You know, the research also mentions signaling proteins like fibroblast growth factor 8 or FGF8 regulating this border war.
Oh, right, the lab studies.
Yeah, if scientists artificially introduce FGF8 into the wrong part of a developing cortex in a lab setting, they completely disrupt this pattern, causing a physical shift in where functional areas develop.
It's wild to see.
It proves the brain's layout isn't a rigid schematic. It's this dynamic, fragile equilibrium of chemical signals.
It is entirely dependent on those gradients maintaining their precise balance. If they're off, the whole map shifts.
So we have this highly optimized, folded, 6-layered factory that builds itself backward using chemical volume dials.
Quite the summary, yeah.
And the traditional narrative in biology is that the cerebral cortex is this uniquely high-level mammalian feature. like the ultimate biological hardware that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom.
Right. But if we step back and look at the broader evolutionary timeline, we really have to dismantle that sense of human exceptionalism.
Because we aren't that special.
Well, because evolution didn't sit down and invent a completely new blueprint just for the human mind.
It didn't reinvent the wheel, it just bought more wheels.
Ah, exactly. That is the core of the radial unit hypothesis, proposed by researcher Pascal Rakic.
Okay, what does that theory state?
The theory states that evolution created new functional areas in the cortex simply by adding more radial units, more of those stem cell scaffolding columns we just talked about.
So instead of designing a fundamentally different type of neuron or a completely new way of processing data, evolution just scaled up the server farm.
Exactly.
It essentially said, let's increase the factory's footprint and build 100,000 more columns.
And it all happens at the stem cell level. By slightly increasing the number of radial glial cells, dividing early in development, you exponentially expand the surface area of the mature cortex.
Which gives us more computing power.
Right, that creates the physical space needed for new, complex association areas, the parts of our brain that handle abstract thought, planning, language, creativity.
That covers how mammals scaled up. But our sources point to some wild structural similarities outside of mammals entirely.
Oh, you mean the birds?
Yes, looking at birds. For a long time, I think the scientific consensus was that only mammals had this kind of complex, layered architecture capable of advanced thought, right?
That was the dogma for decades. But recent evidence shows that the avian brain, specifically a structure called the pallium, has a neuroarchitecture that is incredibly reminiscent of our cerebral cortex.
Which suddenly makes perfect sense when you look at crows or ravens or parrots.
Solving multi-step puzzles.
Yeah, using tools, mimicking human speech. They're terrifyingly smart.
They are. The avian pallium is now recognized as providing an equivalent neural basis for consciousness.
Wow.
They don't have the exact same six-layer mammalian neocortex, but their evolutionary path arrived at a parallel structure capable of incredibly high-order cognition.
That's mind-blowing on its own, but the ultimate shocker in our research stack today is a 2010 study published in the journal Cell.
Oh, the ragworm study.
Yeah. Researchers were looking for counterparts to the cerebral cortex in invertebrates, and they found a profound connection in a sea worm, the ragworm, Plataneris tumerilio.
Yes, and they were analyzing gene expression profiles.
What does that mean in this context exactly?
Well, when scientists talk about gene expression profiles here, they aren't just looking at whether two animals happen to share a specific gene. They're looking at how and where those genes are actively turned on to build specific cells and structures.
Okay.
And molecular signatures of the cells in our cerebral cortex share a deep, unmistakable affinity with structures in the ragworm's brain called mushroom bodies.
Mushroom bodies are the structures responsible for learning and spatial memory in many worms and insects, right?
They are. And this deeply shared gene expression strongly suggests that our cerebral cortex and the ragworm's mushroom bodies share a common evolutionary origin.
The genetic precursors to your ability to do calculus or build a skyscraper or, listen to this deep dive, those specific genetic instructions date back to sea worms in the Precambrian era, hundreds of millions of years ago. The fundamental molecular toolkit for learning and memory was already there, drifting in ancient oceans. The architecture of our cognition is deeply rooted in the very earliest history of complex life on Earth.
It's honestly hard to wrap my head around. Let's bring this journey full circle for you listeners.
Yeah, good idea.
We started by trying to locate yourself. And what we found is this wrinkled sheet of tissue, the thickness of a wedding band, sitting just behind your forehead.
It is a marvel of spatial efficiency, folded like cables in a server farm to eliminate lag. It is a 6-story factory that builds itself inside out, guided by microscopic chemical turf wars, and its lineage stretches all the way back to the dawn of complex life.
It is arguably the most complex structure we know of in the universe, and yet it shares its foundational software with a ragworm.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. If the architecture of the human cerebral cortex is essentially built on a primordial map, one that simply keeps adding more vertical columns to increase computing power, is the difference between human genius and an animal's basic instinct simply a matter of quantity?
It's a huge question.
Right. Are we not utilizing a fundamentally different kind of mind? Are we just running the exact same prehistoric software as a worm, just on a massively scaled up server?